All right, back to where I left off. Sorry about that. So the issue with the sepoys initially was that one of the biggest religious grievances was that oftentimes they found themselves fighting different groups of people that they really had no issue with. And so that in itself was fairly offensive to their religion. They typically believed that you don't fight someone unless you have a grievance. So that was kind of the first strike. The second issue was particular to Hindus who did not like the fact that the British military allowed Hindu women to remarry. And as tension continued to brew and the British looked at ways to kind of control the sepoy population, they decided to do something with the rifle cartridges. So the cartridges at this time had to be coated in animal fat. It's kind of a grease component for them to work properly. And so they decided to coat the cartridges that they gave to the Hindu sepoys. They coated them in cow fat. And cows, of course, are sacred to Hindus. So this was extremely offensive. And then the cartridges that were supposed to be given to the Muslim sepoys were coated in pig fat. And pigs, Muslims don't eat pork. They find them to be unclean animals. And so that was extremely offensive to them. And this was kind of the final straw as far as the treatment that the sepoys were willing to put up with. And this led to what was known as the Sepoy Rebellion. In this particular instance, the sepoys troops rose up. They went after British colonists and massacred British men, women, and children that were living in India at the time. In response, the British military, that was the component of the military that was led by British, not sepoys, responded by torching entire villages and slaughtering thousands of unarmed Indians. From this point on, what's really important to understand, and this was a horrible instance, of course, of violence, is that this really changed the British way of kind of, as you will say, handling the Indian population. And they really started to kind of ramp up their control and their negative treatment of the Indian subcontinent as a whole. If you want to look at any kind of positives of all this that came out, and the story, by the way, goes much further than just this, when it's all kind of said and done, there were some benefits that ultimately set up India for the future. Okay. There was peace and order that was basically existing throughout the countryside while the British were there. That's not going to necessarily be the case once the British leave. They're going to go through some growing pains, particularly with the Muslims and Hindus trying to kind of live together. You will get the creation of railroads, telegraphs, and the postal system that the British will put in place to kind of improve not only transportation across the subcontinent, but also communication. To be honest, the British do this more for them and their ability to operate their business interests and their military interest. They don't do this for the Indian people themselves. If you're going to look at kind of a truly beneficial component, it's that education, Western education, and just even the idea of encouraging more and more people to be educated in India will have probably the longest range consequences. Even to this day, you have quite a few individuals that might grow up in India, go overseas to become educated and trained, and then come back home and kind of put their expertise into practice. So you see some byproduct of that going forward. As we get into the late 1800s, you are going to have kind of this whole generation of Western educated Indian men that had been sent off to England or Scotland and had studied democracy and studied Western ideas of equality. And they then came back to India and they're like, well, this is interesting. I mean, we're not treated like supposedly the Brits believe you should be treated, and that doesn't make any sense. And so they will form what was known as the Indian National Congress. And this was a group of business professionals and professionals like lawyers and doctors and whatnot. And they believed in the idea of peaceful protest. And this is actually where a man named Mahatma Gandhi is going to come into play, is that he is going to be part of this Indian National Congress. They do look forward to eventually the concept of eventual, as they called it, self-rule. You might know that more as independence, but they believed that ultimately they could be westernized and modernized, but not have the British in charge of them. Unfortunately, this group is going to have to kind of break apart in a sense that the Muslims that initially had been part of this group as we get into, through the First World War and into the Second World War, there's a real concern that if India gets its independence, that the government will be entirely Hindu based, and that government will actually oppress the Muslims that are living there. And so this group of Muslims that had been a part of the Indian National Congress break off and eventually form what's called the Muslim League. I should say that together they will work to get independence, and of course that was their primary objective. The reality, unfortunately, is that when the British leave, you are going to have this violent uprising that happens between Muslims and Hindus, and it will force the partition of India, in which the northwestern part of India will become Pakistan, and then the rest of the Indian subcontinent will be Hindu-based. And it will cause people to move. So if you were a Muslim living in, let's say, New Delhi, you will be forced to move to the Pakistan territory that will be reserved for Muslims. And whereas if you were Hindu and living in that region up by Kashmir and whatnot in the mountains, you now have to move into India. So even to this day, India and Pakistan do not get along, and they are split strictly by religion. All right, so your next task I'll put for you guys on Schoology